So just to briefly introduce Professor Tegtmeyer, he obtained his PhD from the University of Leipzig in 2004, completed his habilitation on natural theology at the same university in 2012. He went on to teach logic and epistemology at Gutenberg University in Mainz and theoretical philosophy at Freie Universität Berlin. And since 2013, he has been Associate Professor of Metaphysics and Philosophy of Religion here at the Institute of Philosophy in KU Leuven. His research focuses on the relation between general metaphysics and natural theology, and a second area of specialization is philosophical aesthetics with a special emphasis on German idealism. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Tegtmeyer for his talk entitled Schelling on Seeking God. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason, for the kind introduction. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's a bit intimidating to sit with Mercier in one's back and having his eyes on one, but I'll survive that, I hope. So here are some cryptic signs. Don't care too much about them. I will uncover their meaning in time, but that is for later. The title of the talk is Schelling on Seeking God, and the subtitle is Between Metaphysics and Existentialism, and I'll tell you why. Seeking God is the abiding theme throughout the entire trajectory of Schelling's life as a philosopher and a theologian, as a public intellectual and as a Lutheran Christian. He consistently rejected the apparent alternative between, on the one hand, an existential commitment to faith, and on the other hand, a metaphysical affirmation of God's existence. Unlike his student Kierkegaard, he never accepted the idea that it takes, as it were, a leap of faith to move from impersonal speculative thought to personal conviction. For if speculative thinking is to be worth a thing, it already expresses a deeply personal, existential longing which is much more than a merely abstract quest for certainty. Conversely, our existential search for God or for transcendence needs a robust theoretical underpinning to also satisfy the demands of rationality. This is the baseline of Schelling's entire philosophy. Nevertheless, his views underwent significant changes during his long philosophical career before he eventually performed a surprising existentialist turn in his last writings, a turn that is, again, surprisingly enough, motivated by a renewed engagement with Aristotle and Kant. Before I go into this, I'd say a few words about his biography, since I guess that not too many are familiar with that. And then I go through the different periods of Schelling's development from the early one via the Munich years to his late philosophy. So, biography. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling was born in 1775 in Leonberg, Württemberg, as the second of the 8 children of Joseph Friedrich Schelling, a renowned Lutheran theologian and Orientalist. From early on, the young Schelling's bright mind surprised his family and teachers. At an early age, he already mastered classical Greek and Latin, Hebrew and classical Arabic. He taught the latter when he was still a schoolboy himself, but also modern foreign languages like English, French, and Spanish, becoming fluent in most of them. His talent for science, especially for mathematics and physics, also manifested itself at an early age. When he was 15, he received a special ducal permission to study at the Tübingen Stift, an extremely prestigious institution in which the brightest young minds of Württemberg were offered a rigorous and demanding study program in Lutheran theology, with the best scholars that the Duke was able to hire. Schelling was the youngest student that ever studied theology there. His two roommates were Friedrich Hölderlin and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, both from Stuttgart and both 5 years older than Schelling himself. In spite of the difference in age, the three of them became close friends and soon earned a certain reputation as left-wing radicals who supported the French Revolution. Schelling was even accused of having written a pro-French pamphlet, but eventually escaped sanctions, including the threat of relegation, because his authorship could not be proven, and the others kept silent. Having earned a degree in theology, Schelling went to Leipzig to study mathematics, physics, and medical science. He also practiced as a doctor for some time. At the age of 23, he was appointed extraordinary professor of philosophy at the University of Jena by Johann Wolfgang Goethe, the Minister of Education in the Duchy of Saxony-Weimar. Goethe had already hired Johann Gottlieb Fichte, whom Schelling strongly admired in spite of increasing theoretical and personal differences. Fichte eventually had to leave Jena because his students accused him of atheism, something they would not tolerate. Imagine that. After the publication of the System of Transcendental Idealism, in which Schelling tried to elucidate the similarities and differences between Fichte's philosophy and his own, Schelling himself soon became a celebrity. With his best friend Hegel, who had also moved to Jena in the meantime, he edited the Critical Journal of Philosophy, a highly controversial periodical in which the two young thinkers polemicized extensively against other contemporary varieties of post-Kantian empiricist and skeptical philosophy. This was not the only reason why Schelling himself turned into a controversial figure. The main reason was probably his first marriage, which was found scandalous by many, including Hegel. For in 1803, Schelling married Caroline Schlegel, who was 12 years his senior. She was the daughter of Johann David Michaelis, a famous Lutheran theologian at Göttingen University, the former academic teacher of Schelling's father. Caroline had been widowed at a young age and then been in love with several German revolutionaries at Mainz, and also a young French lieutenant from whom she got pregnant. She was arrested as a Jacobin by Prussian troops in Mainz, but August Wilhelm Schlegel and some other friends of her freed her from jail. Schlegel took her to Saxony and proposed marriage to her, eventually moving her to Jena, her and her daughter. And there, a couple of years later, she fell in love with Schelling, filed for divorce. Goethe negotiated the issue with the Duke and eventually managed to speed up the whole procedure so that Schelling and Caroline could marry in 1803. However, this whole affair had divided the entire academic scene at Jena and led the young couple into isolation, and the friendship with Hegel broke. In 1803, Schelling therefore gladly accepted the appointment at the University of Würzburg, where he stayed until 1806. Then he and his wife moved to Munich, where he became a member of the Academy of Science and later also the secretary of the Academy of Fine Arts. In Munich, he also met his lifelong nemesis, Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, a renowned pietist writer, outspoken fideist, and passionate critic of Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy, who argued for a sharp separation between faith and reason, becoming an important source of inspiration for Kierkegaard, with his image of a salto mortale, a deathly leap from reason into blind faith. And I will return to this. In 1809, in the same year in which Schelling published his Freedom Essay, the last publication during his lifetime, his wife Caroline passed away because of an infectious disease. Schelling started to write the novel Clara to commemorate her, but never finished. He also began his unfinished Ages of the World project, which would later turn into the dual project of a philosophy of mythology and revelation. In 1812, Schelling married Pauline Gotter, the daughter of Carolinus, his first wife's best friend. The marriage was a happy one, and the couple would have 6 children together, among them the Lutheran theologian Carl Friedrich August Schelling, who later also became the editor of Schelling's complete works. During the first decades of his Munich years, Schelling had no regular teaching appointment, but started to give lectures to small selected audiences, first in Stuttgart and later in Erlangen, where he received an honorary professorship. In 1827, he eventually became an ordinary professor of philosophy at the newly established Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Attempts to move Schelling back to Jena were turned down by Goethe, interestingly, because Goethe suspected that Schelling might have tacitly converted to Catholicism in the meantime. No Catholics in Weimar. During all these years, the long-distance polemic between Schelling and his former friend Hegel continued, the latter having become famous at the University of Berlin in the meantime. When Hegel died of cholera in 1831, Schelling expressed his profound regrets about having missed the opportunity to reconcile with his kindred spirit. In 1841, Schelling accepted the invitation to become Hegel's successor. But his philosophical theology was met with a lot of resistance and skepticism by his students, among whom were outspoken atheists and revolutionaries like Friedrich Engels and Mikhail Bakunin, but also outspoken pious Christians like Kierkegaard. Neither the one nor the other camp was very much impressed or inclined to take Schelling seriously. Besides that, Schelling had acquired a reputation as a politically conservative thinker in the meantime, in this respect resembling Hegel. Given that the University of Berlin was considered the center of progressivism, Schelling's appointment was considered not only an anachronism, but a helpless attempt of the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm, to silence the revolutionary voices of the academic youth. Schelling was frustrated, retired soon, but kept working on his system of philosophy virtually until 1854, when he passed away, aged 79. The fragmentary shape of his entire system, which also comes to the fore in his complete works, bothered Schelling himself a lot until the very end of his life. Okay, so now to content, to philosophy. And the first section will be on God and the absolute in Schelling's early philosophy. Just like Hegel, Schelling never gave up his keen interest in theological matters, which already informed the early studies of Plato's philosophy and of biblical topics, but also his speculative interest in nature and in the emerging disciplines of chemistry and biology. Ultimately, even his controversy with Fichte had a theological core. Fichte prided himself being the only orthodox Kantian philosopher who had ever been able to reduce Kant's critical thinking to a rigorous, incontrovertible principle, that is, to the transcendental ego as the absolute beginning of every philosophical move. For Fichte, the transcendental ego, in contrast to the empirical ego, is not only absolute, it is the absolute, the irreducible presupposition of every meaningful belief, including the theistic belief in the existence of God. Schelling rejects this claim for 2 reasons. The first is well known and has received a lot of attention by scholars like Ian Hamilton Grant, Wilimir Stoikovsky. It is the simple observation that, ontologically speaking, no finite ego is ever fully transcendental. We are not absolute. and we know this. We finite egos are constantly aware of our own finitude as products of nature. Finite consciousness is a product of biological evolution, and we must never ignore our ontological dependence. The second reason for rejecting Fichte, which has received much less attention in recent years, even though Hegel stresses it in his so-called difference essay, the Differenzschrift, is more theological. It is the simple claim that the only ego that can ever be called truly absolute is God. In other words, only an ego that does not have to posit a non-ego first in order to become aware of its own existence can be truly called absolute. And this only applies to God, who knows himself even before creation. A Fichtean ego, by contrast, always needs to distinguish itself from an already given non-ego, nature and other minds, to realize its own existence as a thinking and willing being. Much in line with the pious Jena students, Schelling therefore rejects Fichte's atheism, but he does not attack him as impious, but as philosophically insufficient. This controversy eventually led to the emergence of Schelling's own attempt to construct a full-blown system of philosophy, the so-called system of identity. Taking Spinoza's ethics as a model, Schelling attempted to deduce an entire system of theoretical, practical, historical, and aesthetic philosophy from the notion of the absolute, which Schelling conceived of as an indifference or absolute unity of the real and the ideal, matter and form, body and mind. This sounds a lot like Spinoza, not surprisingly. The claim that extensio and cogitatio are two divine attributes. Unlike Spinoza, however, Schelling conceives of the absolute as a thinking and willing subject, or in other words, in terms of a personal God. He takes the license to do so from the Fichtean practical postulate of human freedom. We humans, according to Fichte, are immediately aware of our own freedom, and hence ourselves as persons, and we are morally entitled to claim that free will is not an illusion. If human free will is to be conceived as a product of evolution, the only way to preserve it is to trace it back to an equally free, transcendent, supernatural origin, to God's free will as its absolute basis. If we are persons, then God must be personal too. This claim is further pursued in the Freedom Essay. By then, however, Schelling had already started an extremely polemical debate with Jacobi, who argued that Schelling and the other German idealists, including Fichte, whom Jacobi also disliked profoundly, were Spinozists, and therefore determinists, and that Schelling's defense of free will was just equivocal and insincere. So, accusing other people of insincerity was something that Jacobi did frequently. Ever since his book on Spinoza, Jacobi tried to demonstrate that any rigorous systematic philosophy is unavoidably deterministic, and that the only way to preserve a belief in free will is to abandon systematic philosophy and to resort to a mixture of feeling-based common sense philosophy and faith-based theology. In the Freedom Essay, Schelling sought to prove that the whole issue of systematicity is just a red herring, since the problem lies not in the idea of a philosophical system, but in the conception of the absolute as either impersonal, Spinoza, or personal, as Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel would agree. On this basis, Schelling also rejected Jacobi's equation of pantheism with atheism by calling himself a pantheist but not an atheist, just for the sake of the argument, and that was a move that he later regretted. After 1809, and under the influence of the Catholic scholar and entrepreneur Franz von Baader, Schelling became increasingly interested in Jakob Böhme's mysticism and in Kabbalistic thinking in general, both in its Jewish and Christian varieties. Another predilection, by the way, that he shared with Hegel. Building on Böhmian ideas and images, Schelling tried to form a more detailed philosophical account of divine creation in his Ages of the World, in which the emergence of nature and human history are to be traced back to an inner dynamism of the three divine persons, and most notably of the Father and the Son as demiurgic powers. Schelling kept on promising the quick completion and publication of a monograph under that title, but never kept his word and never completed the Ages of the World. And so this brings me to the later period, the Munich years, the distinction between negative and positive philosophy, and the position of God in that new system. One of the reasons why Schelling kept rewriting the different drafts of the Ages of the World before eventually deciding to drop the project was an increasing self-critical awareness of the shaky methodological foundations of the entire project. Schelling's increasing self-doubts went along with a profound reflection of the limits of philosophy. Of course, the move to the Ages of the World was already motivated by thoughts about the limits of philosophy. Schelling began to think of these limits in terms of a huge discrepancy between, on the one hand, the initial promise of philosophy, that is, wisdom in the shape of an increasingly profound understanding of reality and its governing principles, and, on the other hand, its actual achievements. For Schelling, philosophy not only fails to fulfill its promise, it even withdraws more and more into the shallow waters of conceptual thinking, mere linguistic analysis, or a mere examination of the infrastructure of the human mind. Schelling characterizes this self-amputation of philosophy as negative philosophy. Negative because of its refusal or inability to let reality enter. Its abstinence from more ambitious speculative projects. What he called for was a positive philosophy that really took its task seriously, analyzing reality rather than mere conceptions of reality. This criticism included a piercing self-criticism. During his Munich years, Schelling considered his entire previous philosophy of nature and identity nothing more than another variety of negative philosophy. At the same time, Schelling began to warn his audience against believing the false promises of some systems of negative philosophy. Deductively closed systems, such as Spinoza's, Fichte's, but also Hegel's and Schelling's own previous systems, can deceive their audiences into thinking that those theories are all encompassing, powerful enough to explain the whole of reality, whereas they are actually not more than merely coherent but abstract conceptions and models of reality. For Schelling, this negativity is most clearly reflected in the different ways in which these systems conceive God. For example, as the substance of reality, that's Spinoza, as the idea of totality, that's Fichte, as primordial indifference point, that's Schelling himself in his previous self, or as absolute spirit, that's Hegel. Schelling does not deny that each of these views has a point, but for him they are not more than views. But following the deductive reasoning of their authors, we are misled into mistaking these views for God's own essence. Over his Munich years, however, Schelling's critique became more nuanced. He never became the irresponsible irrationalist that critics like George Lukács and Jürgen Habermas saw in him. In his lectures, Schelling stressed the indispensability of logic and rigorous conceptual thinking, including metaphysical speculation, which is also negative philosophy for him. For philosophy, which he still considered a science, Schelling never believed that metaphysical reasoning can be replaced by mystical inspiration. He never held that philosophy should be transformed into theosophy. In Munich, Schelling eventually realized that his own attempts at Kabbalistic thinking had led him into a dead end, and that the future of philosophy required a combination of traditional negative and innovative positive philosophical methods. The system of negative philosophy did not need to be replaced, but to be complemented by a positive philosophy of nature and history. Accordingly, his lectures after 1830 focused on the philosophy of history. His positive philosophy of nature never matured beyond the level of a rough sketch. For Schelling, philosophy of history must be positive and hence a posteriori. He unequivocally rejected any attempt to come up with an a priori scheme of human history, no matter whether they are optimistic progress narratives such as Kant's, Schiller's, Fichte's, or Hegel's accounts of history, or rather pessimistic stories of decline such as Rousseau's account of the lost golden age of innocence in the state of nature. Schelling took these narratives as mere secularizations of the theological notion of a providential order of history. However, unlike human history, according to those Enlightenment narratives, divine providence can neither be known a priori nor fully deciphered while the process of history is still ongoing. Hence, a positive philosophy of history must steer clear of the hubris of enlightenment and idealism. It must start from the very facts of history without reading any prefabricated narrative pattern into it. For Schelling, the core of human history is the history of religion. For, as Schelling states, man is a God-positing and God-seeking creature. There can only be one God, but there are many religions, including polytheistic and even non-theistic religions. Schelling interprets this diversity as the result of some initial disorder, an original disruption of the relation between God and humankind that is reflected not just in the biblical narrative of original sin, but also in the myth of virtually all the pagan nations of the world. All these myths, of which the book of Genesis offers the clearest and most coherent version, point towards some traumatic experience at the beginning of human history, some self-inflicted catastrophic event that led to a profound alienation between the Creator and his beloved creatures. Schelling urges us to read these myths tautegorically, as he calls it, using a term that he takes over from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. That means a tautegorical reading is a reading that reads a myth as literal as possible, and certainly not allegorically. The philosophy of mythology is an attempt at such a tautegorical comparative analysis of the mythologies of the ancient cultures, including the culture of ancient Israel and Judah as it is depicted in the Old Testament. For Schelling, original sin is the beginning of human history, with all its calamities, violence, cruelty, and superstition, but also with its attempts to render religious faith more humane by reducing violence and by establishing the rule of law. The central turning point, however, is Jesus Christ, in whom God's own will was eventually revealed to the whole of humankind. With Jesus Christ, antiquity came to an end and the modern age began. The philosophy of Revelation focuses on this turning point and its prehistory, beginning with the emergence of Judaism in Abraham and culminating in the exodus from Egypt and the implementation of the Jewish law by Moses. What's the role of negative philosophy within this dual project of a philosophy of mythology and revelation? In the first draft of the Philosophy of Revelation from 1831-32, one has the impression that a negative metaphysical speculation serves as a kind of propedeutic to the positive philosophy of history. Schelling himself is not too clear about this method here, but his scattered remarks suggest that his doctrine of the potencies of being, these will be the potencies of being, I will say more about this in a minute, and that is potential being, actual being, and the unity of both in life and spirit, serves as a conceptual framework that helps to show the coherence of monotheism and to develop a hypothetical account of creation during which the three divine powers constitute themselves as the three divine persons that Christians call the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Using Hesiod's language, Schelling calls this account a theogony. God constitutes himself as God by creating a world whose God he is. God thus turns into the Lord of being. So that's a term that Schelling coins later, but that he keeps. Schelling himself, however, eventually denies any such reading of negative philosophy as a preparation for positive philosophy. And he also rejects the notion of hypothetical thinking as a characterization of what negative philosophy is and does. Instead, he insists on the complete autonomy of the two parts of his mature philosophical system. He conceives his metaphysics of potencies as a rigorous demonstrative science that establishes a universal conceptual framework for metaphysical reasoning. Its claims are apodictic rather than problematic, and its statements are categorical rather than merely hypothetical. Positive philosophy, by contrast, is empirical, hermeneutical, and fallible. It does not aim at proofs, but at plausible reconstructions and the finding of meaningful patterns, but the assent to its claims is free rather than coerced. That Jesus Christ was the incarnated Son of God and the Savior of humankind is a claim of faith for which there are no knockdown arguments. For Schelling, there are indeed good reasons to adopt this belief, but these reasons are not rationally compelling. At the same time, he insists that there's nothing special in this. Historical claims are never compelling, since they always require sufficient trust in the historical sources on which they are based. A historical skepticism that casts doubt on each and every historical document cannot be refuted, but it is not very fruitful. Taking historical documents seriously is a much more promising and intellectually rewarding prima facie attitude, and trusting the Bible is no exception. In sum, given their entirely different methodologies and the completely different degrees of certainty that they can offer, negative and positive philosophy cannot really build on one another. If all goes well, they can play complementary roles, nevertheless, pointing in the same direction somehow or converging on the same fundamental claims. And yet, Schelling kept struggling to determine the relation between negative and positive philosophy more precisely by marking points of transition from the one to the other. One important point of mediation is Schelling's treatise on monotheism that he eventually cut out of the philosophy of revelation, turning it into an introduction to the philosophy of mythology instead. The treatise on monotheism has a dual character inasmuch as it first develops the doctrine of exclusive divine unity on a purely abstract conceptual level by showing that God can only be one by integrating the three basic potencies of being within his own essence, and by then confronting this construction with the most demanding biblical passages in which divine unity is presented as a unity in diversity, or more clearly, as Trinity. Okay, and that brings me to Schelling's late philosophy, In Search of God. All in all, there is a precarious balance between Schelling's negative and positive philosophy of God in his Munich and Berlin lectures. A balance though, that becomes increasingly unstable in his last writings, and most notably in his presentation of a purely rational philosophy. A series of lectures that Schelling never gave, but that contains his final version of negative philosophy. Unlike previous attempts, his version offers a brief history of negative philosophy from Aristotle to Kant, to show that the doctrine of the potencies is not Schelling's invention and not made up by him, but a conceptual framework that all the great thinkers of the past stumbled upon, at least if they carried out pure inquiry rigorously enough. The account of the potencies is still the same, and Schelling uses the same notation that can already be found in the Berlin philosophy of revelation, and that is this one. So potential being is represented by minus A, actual being by plus A, and the unity of both, or powerful actual being, as plus minus A. And then you have the capital A, which refers to being, and later we'll see also to God. And then you have the lowercase a, which refers to the human subject. God, or the absolute subject, or subject-object, as Schelling also says, using this Fichtean term, is represented by A0, capital A0, the created and finite human subject by lowercase a0. And you see the lines, that means that somehow capital A0 is somehow the unity of the three potencies, and lowercase a0 a minor version of the same. This formal notation, which is a bit idiosyncratic, of course, makes it easier for Schelling to neutralize the slightly different terminologies of ancient and modern philosophers and to demonstrate in which sense they search for the same thing. What Schelling wants to show is that philosophy is a God-seeking enterprise. We human relative subjects are searching for the absolute subject. Human reason is will-driven, and what we want to find by employing reason is God. Or it is lowercase a0 in search of capital A0. In this context, Schelling once again defends classical rationalism, most notably Descartes and Malebranche, against its critics. Empiricists often argue that Descartes and Malebranche move too easily from general metaphysics or ontology to special metaphysics or theology, or in other words, that they commit an ontotheological fallacy. Schelling replies that this move is not a fallacy, but a natural and unavoidable transition. It answers the question that ontology raises by itself, that is, the question what the ultimate ground and first cause of being is, including the being of us humans. It is Malebranche who characterizes God as universal being, das allgemeine Wesen, that's the German term that Schelling uses as a translation. This is a good term for Schelling, but also a confusing one. Universal being, ens universale, should not be confused with the scholastic notion of common being, ens commune, the transcendental concept of being. God is not common being, even though pantheism claims exactly this. But God is a separate entity. He is universal only insofar as he is the creator and first cause of the universe of things and processes that we call the world. God is that universal creator and universal cause because of his unique properties that enable him to play these roles. God is the ens realissimum, the supremely perfect being, and at the same time he is the ens necessarium, the being whose existence is necessary, both intrinsically and in relation to the contingent world. Kant later called this conception of God the ideal of pure reason. And Schelling agrees with him. So this is a very important notion for this late text of Schelling's. In special metaphysics, God is represented both as an ideal image of reason itself, a perfectly rational being that would be omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, supremely just and supremely wise, and an ideal image of the ultimate source of the intelligibility of the universe as being well ordered and comprehensible because it was brought into being by a supreme intelligence. Kant further claims that the mind-independent existence of such an entity that corresponds to this ideal cannot be proven. And Schelling eventually agrees with him, albeit for reasons that differ from Kant's own. However, it is not Kant who is discussed most extensively in the presentation, but Aristotle. Schelling compares his own doctrine of the potencies with Aristotle's in great detail, tracing the latter through most of the Stagirite's writings from the Organon via physics to De Anima and eventually to Metaphysics 12. Aristotle is of crucial significance for Schelling's late philosophy because he was perhaps the first philosopher to present a profound metaphysical insight that so many philosophers tend to overlook. Against his teacher Plato, Aristotle taught that the only things that really exist are particulars, and that universals do not exist except in the minds that contemplates reality. Hence, to say that something exists entails that it must be a particular. This certainly goes against Plato, but for Schelling it also goes against the self-proclaimed Aristotelian Hegel, who infamously held that the only things that really exist are the universals, and that the particulars merely participate in the universals. And besides that, the claim goes against idealism in general. To be a realist means to recognize the priority of the particular. And this is the most basic metaphysical lesson that we can learn from Aristotle. Thinking is unavoidably conceptual and hence universal. It categorizes and analyzes particulars according to their universal traits, but without grasping them in their particularity. Individuum est ineffabile, the individual is ineffable. In this respect, Aristotle himself is a nominalist, and Schelling agrees with him. Only particulars can never be fully determinate. Universals are necessarily indeterminate, or mere possibilities, as Schelling says in another late writing, following Leibniz, the other great intellectual hero of the past that he admires. And this has dramatic consequences for theology. For if God exists, he must be a particular too. That means that we fail to grasp God if we merely conceive of him as an ideal of reason. An ideal is a universal, and hence it cannot denote God. The term God, too, is universal. That does not entail singularity. For Schelling, God is not a proper name, and the Jews are right to insist that God's name is a secret. For Schelling, Aristotle reaches the same conclusion on a different path. Aristotle famously proves that a well-ordered moving cosmos needs a prime mover, but he cannot prove that this prime mover is one rather than many. This cannot surprise us if we accept that the particular as such is not an object of science, as Aristotle also teaches. Moreover, Aristotle concludes that the prime mover must be a pure actuality, devoid of potency, for otherwise the prime mover would be mobile and mutable and hence not absolutely unmoved. Schelling takes this characterization to be equivalent with his A0. But, capital A0. But A0 cannot be a unity of minus A and plus A. It cannot be the same as plus minus A, as Schelling himself suggested in his philosophy of revelation. A pure actuality must be completely different from the mere actualization of a prior potency, since it excludes each and every potency. Schelling takes that to mean that Aristotle deliberately uses the term actuality in an equivocal manner, referring both to the potency involving actuality of material substances and processes and the potency excluding actuality of Aristotle's immaterial God or gods. But this backfires on Schelling himself too, for it means that the entire construction of divine nature as a primordial unity of the potencies in his previous versions of negative philosophy fails to reach its aim. It does not only not bring us to God, but it even fails to provide us with the concept of God. Whatever the pedagogical value of the doctrine of the potencies for theology might be, it fails to render God's being intelligible. We simply do not have the concepts that would render God's nature intelligible to us, and Aristotle can help us to realize this final breakdown of metaphysical theology. This suggests, however, that negative philosophy is not superfluous, since it teaches us an important lesson. As Kant puts it, human reason raises questions that it can neither answer nor simply give up, since they arise from the very nature of rationality. Nevertheless, negative philosophy can help us to overcome some transcendental illusions. And one of them is the equation of God with a rational conception of God. Negative philosophy helps us to understand the inadequacy of any variety of the latter, and Aristotle's negative theology is a supremely important and highly instructive example of a rigorous self-destruction of natural theology. In the end, Schelling thus agrees with Kant's conclusion that God's existence cannot be proven by theoretical reasoning. But he does not agree with Kant's premises. For Schelling, the boundaries of pure reason do not run along the dividing line between appearances and things in themselves, but between the universal and the particular. God is not a universal but a particular that does not fall under any universal that we can grasp. Schelling also agrees with Kant's solution. That is, the suggestion to turn from theoretical to practical philosophy, which eventually leads to the so-called moral proof of God's existence. Practical reason, too, necessarily operates within the realm of the universal. And the moral idea of God that Kant comes up with is just that, just another idea. It's not God himself. And as Schelling concludes, that's the only quote I'll give from the presentation, the very point of contemplative life has always been nothing else but the attempt to push through from the universal to the personal level. For person seeks person. Via contemplation, however, the ego could not find more than the idea, even in the best possible case, and hence it could only find God inasmuch as he is contained within the idea. This is the God that is enclosed within reason, where he cannot move, but not the God that is outside of and beyond reason, who can do what reason cannot do, who cannot make us equal to the law, and that is free from it. End of quote. What Schelling thus advocates is not a practical and moral turn to God, but an existential turn. Only the individual leads to God. So that's another quote. reason's desire to know and understand expresses a more existential desire to be united with the ultimate source of one's existence. But this desire cannot be satisfied by pure philosophical thinking. Philosophy does not suffice to overcome original sin. This brings me to my conclusion about the balance between rationalism and fideism in the late Schelling. These considerations also cast a long shadow on Schelling's idea of a philosophical religion that he already presented in the historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology. The presentation, so this other text that I spoke about, which is designed as the second part of this introduction, starts from this very same notion of a philosophical religion. Schelling consistently rejects Hegel's idea that religion can be overcome by philosophy, that concept-based philosophical thinking is superior to image-based religious faith, and that the latter can be sublated in philosophy without substantial losses. For Schelling, philosophy cannot do that. At the same time, the philosopher's task is to be denominationally neutral and to do justice to the insights and errors of every religion. Since Schelling is also convinced that Christianity is the true religion, whereas the other religions get trapped on different levels of error, the task of philosophical religion would basically be to help overcome the differences between Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and the different varieties of Protestantism. Schelling does not share Hegel's triumphalism concerning Lutheran Protestantism as the most advanced form of Christianity, but argues for the overcoming of the differences on a higher level of Christian unity. So in that sense, a kind of ecumenical thinking, of course. His own positive philosophy cannot bring this about by itself, but Schelling's hopes had at least been that it might make some contribution to such a philosophical religion, which would probably be a form of communal Christian life enlightened by philosophy. In the light of Schelling's ultimate ideas concerning the limits of reason, however, it seems as if the contribution of positive philosophy to Christian thinking and to a shared Christian way of life are condemned to be much more limited than Schelling himself had hoped. For if negative philosophy does not lead us to a reliable conceptual framework that positive philosophy can make use of for its interpretation of religious history, then the findings of positive philosophy are even less binding than Schelling initially took them to be. Does this all mean that Schelling eventually surrenders to Jacobi? In other words, does he not finally agree with Jacobi that faith must leave reason behind to reach its true vocation? Is systematic thinking an obstacle to faith? For two reasons, this is not the message that Schelling wants to get across at all. First of all, there is a difference in rhetoric. Jacobi constantly warns his readers against the dangers of philosophy and systematic thinking, both of which he considers a threat to faith. Schelling would never agree that profound and rigorous thinking can be dangerous to true faith. For him, only superficial and insufficiently ambitious thinking are dangerous to faith, social life, and public opinion. But they are dangers that we must live with, apparently. Second, Schelling resolutely denies that a feeling-based faith can replace rational thinking. Attempting this would be a terrible refusal to live up to our vocation as essentially rational creatures, and a denial of human nature. In this, Schelling agrees with Hegel, who presents the same objection against Jacobi. For Schelling, the final breakdown of a purely rational inquiry into God's nature is an important philosophical lesson that we can only learn by engaging in philosophy ourselves. As God-seeking rational creatures, we need the personal experience that rationality fails us in the end, insofar as it does not suffice to establish a personal relationship with God. In the language of the system of identity, we could say that philosophy merely establishes an ideal relation between God and humankind, but that what we want is a real relation on a personal level. That is, a relationship between us as persons and the personal God. Finally, the fact that negative philosophy does not get us where we want to be does not mean that we do not gain anything positive from it. We humans are concept-mongering creatures. That's a term from Robert Brandom. We cannot grasp reality without using concepts. We do not simply want a personal relationship with God, but we also want to think and speak about ourselves and our position in the world, including our relation to God, and we want to discuss with people who either do not believe in God at all or who ascribe other properties to God than we do. Philosophy can teach us not only that our concepts of God are necessarily inadequate, but also how to use the least inadequate ones and to do so with the required modesty and caution. In the subtitle of this paper, I call Schelling a thinker between metaphysics and existentialism. We can see that Schelling eventually takes several steps towards existentialism, in partial agreement with religious existentialists like Jacobi and Kierkegaard. At the same time, even the late Schelling would refuse to choose between the one and the other. Even a religious existentialism needs a robust metaphysical foundation, albeit a negative one. Thanks for your attention.